Long before the world had ever heard of an empire, there was a myth. And like all great civilizations, Rome began with a story, half history, half legend, whispered across centuries, shaping how Romans themselves understood their destiny. In the 8th century before Christ, when the hills of central Italy were dotted with small farming villages, the people spoke of a miraculous tale. They said that 2 infant brothers, Romulus and Remus, were born of divine blood. Their mother, Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin, claimed that their father was none other than Mars, the god of war. But mortal politics are often more cruel than the gods. The twins' great-uncle, a king who feared rivals to his throne, ordered the babies to be drowned in the waters of the Tiber River. Yet fate had different plans. The river's current carried them gently to shore, where a she-wolf, fierce and watchful, discovered the helpless children. Instead of devouring them, she suckled them with her milk. Soon after, a shepherd found the boys and raised them as his own. This image of human children nourished by a wolf became one of the most powerful symbols of Roman identity. It was wild, primal, and defiant. The Romans would always see themselves as born out of struggle, chosen by destiny, and survivors of abandonment. As the brothers grew into strong young men, they dreamed of founding a great city near the very river that had saved them. But ambition has always been Rome's greatest strength and its greatest curse. Romulus and Remus could not agree on where their city should stand. The quarrel grew bitter, and in a moment of rage, Romulus struck down his own brother. Remus fell, and Romulus stood alone as the founder. In 753 BCE, according to tradition, Romulus marked out the boundaries of his new settlement. He called it Roma after his own name. He became its first king, and the Romans would forever tell the story of their city's bloody, fateful beginning. Thus Rome was born, not in peace, but in conflict. And conflict would shape its destiny for more than 1,000 years. The Romans believed that after Romulus, 6 other kings ruled the young city, and each left their mark. Numa Pompilius, the second king, was a man of peace. He gave Rome its early laws and religious traditions, establishing temples and rituals that gave structure to a people who were still half wild. Others, like Tullus Hostilius, were warriors, relentlessly expanding Rome's power over its neighbors. Then came Servius Tullius, who reorganized the city, dividing its people into classes and tribes, creating the very foundations of Roman politics. But the era of kings was not to last. The final king, Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud, ruled as a tyrant. He was cruel, arrogant, and his downfall would be the spark that changed Rome forever. The story goes that his son's vile act against a noblewoman named Lucretia ignited an unstoppable wave of outrage. The people of Rome rose up together, swearing an oath that they would never again be ruled by a king, and drove the Tarquins into exile. In their place, the Romans created something new, something they believed would prevent tyranny from ever taking root again: the Republic. Power was divided among elected magistrates, the Senate, and the assemblies of the people. This idea was revolutionary. Instead of a single ruler, Rome would be governed by laws, by debate, and by the shared duty of its citizens. Of course, in practice, the powerful still found ways to dominate, and the poor still struggled for their voice. But the seed had been planted. Rome would not be ruled by kings. It would be ruled by Romans. What made early Rome so different from its neighbors was not wealth or power. In those days, it had little of either. It was the character of its people. They valued discipline, hard work, and above all, loyalty to the state. They believed in sacrifice, both on the battlefield and at home. And they believed that Rome was destined for greatness, that their city was more than just a city. It was a story written by the gods themselves. Even when history blurred with myth, Romans held tightly to these legends. They told them again and again, not just to record facts, but to explain who they were. In the stories of Rome's founding, they saw their own identity: fierce, disciplined, chosen, and eternal. But greatness always comes at a cost. The same ambition that drove Romulus to kill his brother, that pushed the Romans to overthrow their kings, would one day drive generals to civil war and emperors to tyranny. From the very beginning, Rome was born in struggle, and struggle would never leave it. This is where it all begins. On the banks of the Tiber with the wolf, the twins, and the dream of a city. From this fragile beginning, Rome would rise, from a humble village to a powerful republic and eventually to a world-spanning empire. And though it would one day fall, the story of Rome is a story that never truly ends. Thank you for joining us on this journey back in time. Imagine a world where a single king holds the fate of an entire nation in his hands. Now imagine that nation rising up, casting him out and swearing an oath, never again. This wasn't just a change of rulers for the Romans, it was a complete reshaping of their destiny. In place of a monarchy, they built something the ancient world had rarely seen, a republic. This new system was messy, fragile, and constantly on the brink of collapse. But it gave Rome a strength that kingdoms could only dream of. It created a space for debate, for fierce competition, and for raw ambition to be channeled into building something greater. This republic would become the bedrock of Rome's legendary rise, and, ironically, would also plant the seeds of its eventual, spectacular fall. In the year 509 BCE, the Romans made a promise. They created a system where power was not held by one, but divided among many. At its very heart stood the Senate, a council of Rome's most powerful and influential men. Now, these senators weren't elected by a popular vote. They were the patricians, drawn from ancient noble families whose wealth and ancestry gave them an almost sacred authority. The Senate wasn't the government itself, but it was the guiding hand behind everything: foreign policy, the treasury, and military campaigns. In Rome, the Senate's advice was, for all intents and purposes, a command. But who held the ultimate executive power? That fell to the consuls. 2 men, elected each year, held the highest authority in Rome. But here's the brilliant part. They ruled together, and each one could veto the other's decisions. This was a clever check against tyranny, but it also meant constant rivalry and political maneuvering. Every year new consuls were chosen, ensuring that Rome's leadership was always in motion, never stagnant. And then, there were the assemblies of the people, where ordinary Roman citizens could gather to vote on laws, elect magistrates, and even decide on matters of war and peace. This was where the common man had a voice, though, in reality, not all voices were equal. This complex, chaotic balance of power became Rome's defining feature. Not one ruler, but many. Not one voice, but a chorus of competing interests. It was unstable. It was often inefficient. But boy, was it alive. However, beneath this proud new system, a deep tension was brewing. While the patrician families dominated the Senate and the consulship, the vast majority of Romans, the plebeians, found themselves on the outside looking in. Sure, they could vote, but they were barred from holding the highest offices. They filled the ranks of Rome's legions, bleeding and dying for their city, but had precious little say in how it was governed. Unsurprisingly, the plebeians grew restless. They demanded basic rights, protection from the abuses of the nobles, and a fair share of the prosperity they helped create. And so began what historians now call the conflict of the orders, a struggle between the upper and lower classes that would span centuries. It was a slow, grinding fight for equality. At times, the plebeians would go on strike, refusing to serve in the army until their demands were met. In more extreme cases, they would secede from the city entirely, leaving Rome paralyzed until the patricians were forced to the negotiating table. And slowly, step by step, the plebeians won crucial victories. They created their own representatives, the tribunes of the plebs, who had the extraordinary power to veto laws that harmed the common people. They fought for and won the 12 Tables, Rome's first written code of law, ensuring that justice could no longer be a secret weapon wielded by the nobles. The struggle was never fully resolved, but it forged something rare and powerful in Roman society. The idea that even the humblest citizen could, in theory, rise to greatness. While Rome was consumed by these internal class struggles, it was also looking outward. Early Italy was a dangerous, fragmented patchwork of different peoples. You had the warlike Samnites in the mountains, the cultured Etruscans to the north, and wealthy Greek colonies dotting the southern coast. Rome, at this point still just a single city-state, had to fight constantly just to survive. And with every fight, Rome learned. Each war taught new strategies. Each victory brought new allies. But Rome had a secret weapon, a remarkable talent that set it apart. When it conquered a people, it didn't just subjugate them, it often offered them a place within the Roman system. Sometimes this meant full Roman citizenship, with all its rights and privileges. Other times it meant partial rights, the ability to trade with Rome, marry Romans, or crucially to serve in its ever-growing armies. By weaving its conquered enemies into its own social fabric, Rome brilliantly turned rivals into partners. This wasn't charity, it was cold, calculated, and incredibly effective strategy. By the end of the 3rd century BCE, Rome had brought all of Italy under its dominion. It was no longer just a city, it was the master of a peninsula, with legions hardened by endless warfare and a network of allies bound by treaties, law, and the promise of opportunity. Of course, Rome's meteoric rise did not go unnoticed. Across the seas, other powers watched with growing anxiety. The Greek cities in southern Italy were particularly nervous as this Latin upstart expanded relentlessly southward. Some of these cities decided to call for help, and in one famous instance they invited a foreign king, Pyrrhus of Epirus, to come and defend them. Pyrrhus was a brilliant general, a cousin of Alexander the Great, and he brought a professional army and a terrifying new weapon to Italy: war elephants. He stunned the Roman legions in battle, winning victory after victory. And yet, Rome endured. Even when Pyrrhus won, his own army was so battered and bloodied that he is famously said to have sighed, "Another such victory and I am undone." From his costly campaign we get the timeless phrase, a Pyrrhic victory, a win so devastating it feels like a defeat. In this war, Rome had shown the world something truly terrifying. It could suffer disaster, absorb punishing blows, and yet rise from the ashes stronger than before. So what was it that truly defined the Republic in these formative centuries? It wasn't wealth, and it wasn't yet a sprawling empire. It was resilience. It was an unshakable spirit. Every setback was treated as temporary. Every loss was a lesson to be learned. Rome did not surrender. It adapted, it improved, it came back harder. And this relentless spirit, forged in the fires of the class struggle between patricians and plebeians, and honed on the battlefields of Italy, was the true foundation of its future greatness. Because soon Rome's ambitions would stretch far beyond the Italian peninsula. Soon it would collide with a mighty rival across the sea, a power as disciplined, as ambitious, and as determined as Rome itself. And that clash of titans would not just shake the Mediterranean, it would change the world forever. The drums of war rumble in the distance, a low thunder echoing the crash of waves against a rocky shore. The year is 264 BC. The Roman Republic, forged in iron and discipline, has conquered the Italian peninsula. Its legions stand as the most formidable fighting force the world has yet seen, but they are not alone. Across the shimmering Mediterranean, another power has risen, ancient, proud, and impossibly wealthy. This is Carthage. Founded centuries earlier by seafaring Phoenicians, Carthage is a city of merchants and sailors. Its empire is not one of conquered lands, but of lucrative trade routes that crisscross the sea. Its harbors teem with ships from distant shores, and its vaults overflow with silver. Rome is a power of the land, its strength rooted in the discipline and steel of its infantry. Carthage is a power of the sea, its dominance assured by its massive navy and commercial might. A clash between these two titans was not just likely, it was inevitable. And when it came, it would ignite a conflict spanning more than a century. A struggle for supremacy so brutal, so epic, that its echoes would be felt for millennia. This is the story of the Punic Wars. It all began on the sun-drenched island of Sicily. A strategic jewel coveted by both powers, Sicily became the flashpoint. When local disputes spiraled out of control, both Rome and Carthage answered the call of their allies, sending armies to the island. The first great test had arrived. The problem for Rome was simple: Carthage was a naval giant, and Rome, well, Rome barely had a navy to speak of. They were a land power through and through. But if there was one Roman superpower, it was their astonishing ability to adapt and innovate. When a Carthaginian warship, a state-of-the-art quinquereme, washed up on an Italian shore, the Romans didn't just study it, they reverse-engineered it. In a matter of months, they constructed a fleet of over 100 ships, a direct copy of the Carthaginian design. Still, they lacked the centuries of seafaring experience their enemies possessed, so they invented a way to nullify that advantage. They created the corvus, a massive spiked boarding bridge that could be dropped onto an enemy ship, locking the two vessels together. Suddenly, a naval battle became a land battle on floating platforms, and on land, nobody could stand against the Roman legionary. The First Punic War was a grueling 23-year slog. Battles raged across Sicily and on the high seas. Rome even launched a daring but ultimately failed invasion of North Africa. The war bled both sides dry, testing their resolve to the absolute limit. Finally, in 241 BCE, off the Aegean Islands, the newly minted Roman navy achieved what was once unthinkable. They crushed the Carthaginian fleet in a decisive battle. The terms of surrender were humiliating for Carthage. They were forced to cede Sicily to Rome and pay a crippling war indemnity. For the first time, Rome was a naval power. For the first time, Carthage had been truly defeated. But defeat doesn't always lead to peace. Sometimes it breeds a burning desire for revenge. From the ashes of Carthage's humiliation rose one of history's most brilliant and fearsome military commanders, Hannibal Barca. Son of a Carthaginian general from the First War, Hannibal was raised on stories of Roman aggression. Legend says that as a boy his father made him swear a sacred oath upon an altar, to harbor an eternal hatred for Rome and to dedicate his life to its destruction. He was a promise of vengeance made flesh. In 218 BCE, Hannibal made his move. The Romans expected an attack by sea, the traditional route, but Hannibal was anything but traditional. He chose a path so audacious, so insane that the Romans never even considered it a possibility. He would march his army from Spain, through Gaul, and over the treacherous, snow-capped peaks of the Alps, directly into Italy's heartland. It was a monumental gamble. His army faced blizzards, rock slides, and hostile tribes. Thousands of men and animals perished in the icy passes. And with him, he brought his secret weapon, war elephants, colossal beasts of battle the likes of which Italy had never seen. The survivors, though battered, emerged from the mountains, striking terror into the Roman populace. What followed was a masterclass in military genius. At the Battle of the Trebia, Hannibal shattered a Roman consular army. At Lake Trasimene, he ambushed and annihilated another. But his masterpiece came in 216 BCE, on the plains of Cannae. Facing a Roman army nearly double the size of his own, Hannibal executed one of the most famous tactical maneuvers in history, the double envelopment. He allowed his center to buckle, drawing the massive Roman force into a trap. Then his cavalry and infantry slammed into the Roman flanks and rear, completely encircling them. It was a slaughter. By the end of the day, tens of thousands of Roman soldiers lay dead. It remains one of the bloodiest single days of battle in history. Rome was on its knees. Its allies began to defect. The city itself trembled, bracing for the final assault. For a moment, it seemed the eternal city was destined to fall. But Rome did not break. Where any other nation would have sued for peace, Rome refused to negotiate. It mourned its dead, and then it raised new armies. The Senate appointed a new dictator, Fabius Maximus, whose strategy earned him the nickname Cunctator, the delayer. He avoided open battle with Hannibal, shadowing his army, harassing his supply lines, and slowly wearing him down in a war of attrition. For nearly 15 years, Hannibal rampaged through Italy, a seemingly unstoppable force. But he could never land the killing blow. Carthage, politically divided and hesitant back home, failed to send him the crucial reinforcements and siege equipment he needed to take Rome itself. The Romans, ever adaptable, found a new champion, a young general named Publius Cornelius Scipio. He realized that the only way to get Hannibal out of Italy was to take the war to Africa. Scipio invaded Carthage's homeland, forcing Hannibal to be recalled to defend his city. In 202 BCE, the two legendary generals finally met at the Battle of Zama. This time it was Scipio who proved the superior tactician. Using Hannibal's own tactics against him, Scipio crushed the Carthaginian army. Hannibal had been defeated. Carthage surrendered once again. This time, the peace terms were even more severe. They lost all their overseas territories, including Spain. Their navy was reduced to a handful of ships. They were forbidden from waging war without Rome's permission. Rome was now the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. Scipio returned a hero, earning the name Africanus in honor of his victory. But for some in Rome, even this total victory wasn't enough. Decades passed. Though politically neutered, Carthage, the city of merchants, began to rebuild its commercial wealth. This economic revival stoked old fears and resentments in Rome. One senator in particular, Cato the Elder, became the voice of this paranoia. He saw any Carthaginian success as a future threat. He ended every speech he gave in the Senate, no matter the topic, with the same 5 chilling words: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Finally, in 149 BCE, Rome found a pretext for war. An army was dispatched not just to defeat Carthage, but to erase it from existence. The legions laid siege to the great city. For 3 long years, the Carthaginians mounted a desperate, heroic defense. They fought for every street, every house, every inch of their homeland. The population, once numbering in the hundreds of thousands, fought to the last man, woman, and child. But the outcome was inevitable. In 146 BCE, Carthage fell. What followed was not conquest, but annihilation. The Romans went on a week-long rampage of destruction, burning the city to the ground. Those who weren't killed were sold into slavery, and, as the legend goes, the Romans then plowed the fields and sowed them with salt, a symbolic curse to ensure that nothing would ever grow there again. Carthage was no more. The Punic Wars transformed Rome. It had entered the conflict as a regional Italian power and emerged as the master of the Mediterranean. Its navy ruled the seas. Its armies had proven their resilience, surviving disasters that would have shattered any other nation. But victory came at a price. The wars changed the very fabric of Roman society. Immense wealth from conquered lands flooded into Rome, fueling corruption and greed. Small family farms were swallowed up by vast, slave-run estates owned by the super-rich. Ambitious generals, enriched by conquest and commanding loyal armies, began to challenge the authority of the Senate. Rome had crushed its greatest enemy. But with Carthage destroyed, the Republic's greatest battles would no longer be fought against foreign kings or rival empires. The greatest threat to Rome was now Rome itself. The seeds of civil war had been sown. Ambition, blood, and betrayal lay ahead, and soon the Republic itself would tremble and fall. Crowds roar in a Roman forum. A sword clatters in the sand of an arena. The sound fades into silence, leaving only the faint echo of voices in marble halls. Rome's victories brought wealth, but also greed. Senators grew rich, generals grew powerful, and the common people grew restless. Civil war brewed as ambitious men like Marius and Sulla turned their armies against Rome itself. In the shadows of the Colosseum, and in the blood of gladiators, the Republic began to crack, foreshadowing an empire born in violence. Rome stood triumphant after the Punic Wars. Her fleets ruled the seas, her legions dominated foreign lands, and treasures from across the Mediterranean poured into the city. But victory had its price. The spoils of conquest flowed into the hands of the elite. Senators and patricians grew richer than ever, buying up vast estates and replacing citizen farmers with slaves captured abroad. Meanwhile, ordinary Roman citizens found themselves impoverished, displaced, and forced to crowd into the city in search of work. The gulf between the rich and the poor widened into a chasm. The Republic, which had once prided itself on shared sacrifice and civic duty, now strained under the crushing weight of inequality. The Senate, dominated by aristocrats, ignored the cries of the common people. But resentment was brewing, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Into this storm stepped Gaius Marius. Unlike most men in power, Marius was not born into aristocracy. He was a new man, a self-made soldier who rose through the ranks on sheer ability and grit. Marius saw both opportunity and danger in Rome's unrest. He offered the poor a chance they couldn't refuse. Join the army. Traditionally, only landowners could serve as Roman soldiers. Marius shattered that tradition. He opened the legions to the landless citizens, promising them steady pay, a share of the plunder, and most importantly, a plot of land upon retirement. The response was overwhelming. The poor rallied to him, not out of loyalty to the Senate or the abstract idea of the Republic, but out of personal loyalty to Marius himself. Rome had always been defended by citizen soldiers who were also farmers and landowners. Now, for the first time, her armies became professional forces, loyal to their general above the state. It was a dangerous, fundamental shift. Marius became consul not once, but an unprecedented 7 times. He was hailed as a hero, the defender of the people, but his rise also fueled deep division and fear within Rome's political elite. Across the city, another figure watched Marius's rise with suspicion and envy. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician by birth, was every bit as ambitious as Marius, but far more ruthless. Sulla had first served under Marius, but soon the two men became bitter rivals. Their conflict was not just personal. It represented the deepening divide between two political factions that were tearing Rome apart. The populares, who sought power by appealing to the people and pushing for reforms, and the optimates, the conservative aristocrats who clung desperately to the authority of the Senate. Marius championed the populares. Sulla stood for the optimates. Their struggle would soon plunge Rome into a chaos from which it would never truly recover. The rivalry reached its breaking point when command of a lucrative military campaign against Mithridates of Pontus was contested. The Senate initially awarded the command to Sulla, but Marius's supporters, using a popular vote, stripped it from him and handed it to Marius. Sulla's response was unprecedented and shocking. He did the unthinkable. He turned his legions, men sworn to protect Rome, toward the city itself. For the first time in its long history, a Roman general marched on Rome. The streets filled with soldiers, not foreign enemies, but Romans fighting Romans. Blood was spilled in the very heart of the Republic. Sulla seized power by force, restored his command, and forced his rival, the aged Marius, into exile. The Republic had crossed a line from which there was no return. Rome's own armies had become weapons in political struggles, loyal not to the state, but to the men who paid them. But Rome's turmoil did not end there. While Sulla was away waging war in the east, Marius returned from exile old but unbroken. Rallying his supporters, he seized Rome once again, unleashing a wave of bloody purges against his political enemies in the Senate. The city was gripped by terror. When Sulla eventually returned, victorious from his campaign, he reclaimed the city in turn. A full-blown civil war erupted, and the Republic became a battlefield. Sulla's victory over Marius's supporters was total. He then took a step that shattered all precedent. He declared himself dictator. Not for the traditional 6 months allowed in an emergency, but indefinitely. Under his absolute rule, Rome descended into a nightmare. Sulla issued his infamous proscriptions, lists of men condemned to death without trial. Their names were posted publicly in the Forum. Their wealth was seized. Their families hunted down. Neighbors betrayed neighbors. Sons were forced to turn against fathers. And the city lived in a constant state of fear. Sulla attempted reforms, trying to strengthen the Senate and curb the power of the popular tribunes who had enabled Marius. But his dictatorship, built on violence and fear, left a scar that never healed. And when he eventually, astonishingly retired and stepped down from absolute power, the republic he left behind was fractured beyond repair. Amid this political chaos, the Roman people sought escape. They crowded into the massive arenas to watch gladiators fight for survival. The roar of the crowd, the clash of steel, the spill of blood on the hot sand, it became both a spectacle and a distraction from the crumbling world outside. But the gladiators' struggles mirrored Rome itself, brutal, merciless, and driven by the ambition of powerful men. The arena was not just entertainment. In many ways, it was prophecy. The age of Marius and Sulla revealed a dangerous, fatal truth. Rome's greatest threat was no longer a foreign enemy at the gates, but her own unchecked ambition. Generals had discovered that armies could topple laws, and that the loyalty of soldiers could outweigh loyalty to the Senate. The Republic still stood, its marble columns gleaming in the sun. But the cracks in its foundation had widened into fissures, and soon into those cracks would step another man, one whose ambition would finally bring the old world crashing down, and whose name would echo for eternity. A blade is unsheathed, followed by silence. Sound of rolling thunder and boots marching in wet mud. A voice whispers, "The die is cast." A brief tense pause, followed by the faint steady sound of a legion marching. Out of the chaos of a dying republic, one man rose, Julius Caesar. He was a brilliant general, a master politician, beloved by his soldiers and feared by his rivals. His conquest of Gaul made him a legend. His crossing of the Rubicon made him a traitor, and his death, on the Ides of March, made him immortal. Julius Caesar was born in 100 BCE into the Julian clan, a noble family with more name than money. But from a young age, Caesar possessed two things that would forge his destiny: a burning ambition and an undeniable charisma. He was a survivor. As a young man, he dodged the political purges of the dictator Sulla, learning early on how to navigate the deadly game of Roman politics. He was eloquent, bold, and fearless, traits that drew both followers and enemies. Caesar saw the truth of his time. Rome was no longer ruled by tradition. Power belonged to those ruthless enough to seize it. As he climbed the political ladder, Caesar positioned himself as a champion of the common people. His charm and grand gestures won him allies in the streets, while his massive debts earned him suspicion in the Senate. But Caesar's true genius was in forming alliances. In 60 BCE, he forged the first triumvirate, a secret pact with two of Rome's most powerful men: Pompey the Great, the celebrated general, and Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Together they bent the Republic to their will. Caesar secured the highest office, the consulship, and then the prize he truly wanted: a military command in Gaul. It was here his name would become eternal. From 58 to 50 BCE, Caesar waged a relentless and brutal war across what is now modern France and Belgium. His campaigns were masterpieces of military strategy. He defeated powerful tribes, crossed uncharted rivers, and even launched daring expeditions into Britain and Germany. And he made sure everyone back home knew it. His own writings, the commentaries on the Gallic War, were brilliant pieces of propaganda, broadcasting his victories throughout Rome. But his men loved him for more than just his victories. Caesar shared their hardships. He marched alongside them, ate the same rations, and knew them by name. To his legions, he wasn't just a commander. He was their leader, their father figure. By the time Gaul was conquered, Caesar was a hero of mythical status, and his soldiers' loyalty was absolute. They would follow him anywhere. And that is what terrified the Senate. While Caesar was building his legend in Gaul, his alliance back in Rome was crumbling. Crassus was killed in battle, and Pompey, once Caesar's partner, grew jealous and sided with Caesar's enemies in the Senate. They issued an ultimatum: Caesar must disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. To obey meant facing his rivals, powerless and vulnerable, a likely death sentence. To refuse meant civil war. On a cold winter's night in 49 BCE, Caesar stood at the banks of a small river, the Rubicon. It marked the boundary of Italy, and crossing it with an army was an act of treason. He paused, knowing this decision would change the world forever. Then, as legend tells it, he whispered the words, "Alea iacta est." The die is cast. His legions crossed. The civil war had begun. Rome was split in two. Pompey fled to Greece to gather his forces, but Caesar moved with lightning speed, securing Italy and Spain before confronting his rival. At Pharsalus in 48 BCE, their armies finally clashed. Though heavily outnumbered, the discipline and genius of Caesar's veteran legions won the day. Pompey fled again, this time to Egypt, where he was betrayed and murdered before Caesar even arrived. They presented Caesar with Pompey's severed head. It's said that Caesar wept. His greatest rival was gone, and with him, the last major obstacle to his absolute power. Caesar returned to Rome as the undisputed master of the Roman world. He was appointed dictator first for a year, then for 10, and finally in 44 BCE, dictator for life. He launched a series of ambitious reforms, creating a new calendar, helping the poor, and expanding Roman citizenship. To many he was a savior, bringing order out of chaos. But to the old guard of the Senate, he was a tyrant. Whispers grew louder. Was Caesar planning to make himself king? For Romans who had thrown out their kings centuries ago to found the Republic, that word was poison. On the morning of March 15th, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, Caesar walked to a Senate meeting. He ignored bad omens, the warnings of a soothsayer, and even the pleas of his wife. He believed he was untouchable. But inside the theater of Pompey, a group of senators waited, daggers hidden in their togas. They surrounded him. Among them was a man he had mentored and trusted, Marcus Junius Brutus. Blow after blow rained down. Caesar fought back, but when he saw Brutus among his attackers, his will broke. His supposed last words have echoed through history. Et tu, Brute? You too, Brutus? Then he covered his face with his toga and fell, lifeless, at the feet of a statue of his old enemy, Pompey. The man who had conquered Gaul, who had crossed the Rubicon, who had made himself master of Rome, was dead. But death was not the end for Caesar. His assassins had hoped to restore the Republic. Instead, they unleashed a new, more brutal cycle of civil war. In the end, it was not the Republic that triumphed, but Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian. He would hunt down the conspirators, defeat his rivals, and emerge as Augustus, Rome's first true emperor. Caesar had fallen, but his shadow loomed larger than ever. His name became a title, Caesar, carried by Roman emperors for centuries. His life marked the end of the Roman Republic and the dawn of the Roman Empire, a legacy that shaped the course of Western civilization. Sound of rolling thunder and marching boots returns, then slowly fades. A voice whispers, "The die is cast." Sound of trumpets, a city celebrating, which then fades into a tense, rhythmic hum. After Julius Caesar was murdered, Rome didn't find peace. It found chaos. The assassins thought they were heroes saving the Republic, but all they did was light the fuse on another brutal civil war. Out of that fire and smoke, a new figure emerged. Not a hardened general or a seasoned politician, but a teenager named Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir. He was about to play the most dangerous game in the world. He would have to outsmart his rivals, crush Rome's enemies, and ultimately transform a crumbling republic into a mighty empire. When the dust settled, and he stood victorious over his final rivals, Antony and Cleopatra, he would take a new name, Augustus. He would become the very first emperor of Rome, and under his command, the world would enter an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity, the Pax Romana. This is the story of how a boy conquered the world. The Ides of March, 44 BCE. Caesar lies dead on the Senate floor. His killers, Brutus and Cassius, expected cheers and parades. Instead, they got rage. The streets of Rome erupted in fury. Mobs hunted down anyone suspected of conspiracy. Caesar's funeral wasn't a somber affair. It was a battle cry for vengeance. The assassins, realizing their fatal miscalculation, fled for their lives. Into this power vacuum stepped three men. First, Mark Antony, Caesar's charismatic and loyal right-hand man. Next, Marcus Lepidus, a powerful general. And finally, the wild card, 18-year-old Octavian. Nobody took him seriously. He was seen as a sickly, inexperienced boy playing at being a man. But what they all underestimated was his brilliant, ruthless mind. He possessed a cunning that far surpassed his years. In 43 BCE, these three rivals did the unthinkable. They formed an alliance, the Second Triumvirate. Their stated goal? to hunt down and destroy Caesar's murderers. Their methods were terrifying. They published prescription lists, official death sentences for thousands of so-called enemies of the state. Wealthy citizens were executed, their property and fortunes seized to fund their armies. It was a reign of terror that secured their grip on Rome. With the capital under their bloody control, the triumvirs marched their legions east. At the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, they cornered Brutus and Cassius. The battle was a decisive, crushing victory for the triumvirs. Seeing no way out, both Brutus and Cassius took their own lives. With them died the last faint hope of the old republic. But with their common enemy gone, the alliance of the three most powerful men in Rome began to crack. A new conflict was brewing, one that would be even bigger. The triumvirate wasn't built to last. Lepidus, the third wheel, was quickly and cleverly pushed aside, leaving the Roman world split between two titans, Octavian and Mark Antony. Octavian controlled the west, including Rome itself. Antony took the east, the rich exotic provinces, and most importantly, Egypt. And in Egypt, Antony met Cleopatra. The Queen of the Nile was brilliant, charming, and ambitious. Their political alliance quickly blossomed into one of history's most legendary love affairs. Together they dreamed of a new grand empire with its heart in the east. Back in Rome, Octavian saw his opportunity. He launched one of the most effective propaganda campaigns in history. He painted Antony not as a Roman general, but as a traitor, a man bewitched and controlled by a foreign seductress. He told the people that Antony planned to abandon Rome, to move the capital to Alexandria, and rule as an Eastern king. He stoked the fires of xenophobia and nationalism. Antony was no longer a Roman hero. He was a threat. The stage was set for the final, epic confrontation. It was a battle for the soul of Rome. The year is 31 BCE. The place? The waters off the coast of Actium in Greece. This is it. The final showdown. On one side, Octavian's fleet commanded by his brilliant admiral Marcus Agrippa. Their ships are smaller, faster, more agile. On the other, the combined navy of Antony and Cleopatra. Their ships are massive, opulent warships, floating fortresses bristling with soldiers. The battle begins. For hours, the sea is a chaotic mess of ramming ships, flaming arrows, and desperate hand-to-hand combat. The fighting is brutal, the outcome uncertain. Then, at a critical moment, something strange happens. Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships breaks formation and sails away from the battle. Antony sees her leaving. Torn between his duty as a commander and his love for the queen, he makes a fatal choice. He abandons his men, abandons his fleet, and follows her. The sight of their general deserting them shatters the morale of Antony's forces. His fleet, now leaderless and in disarray, is systematically destroyed or captured by Agrippa. Octavian has won. The Battle of Actium wasn't just a naval victory. It was the moment the Roman Republic effectively died, and the Roman Empire was born. Defeated and disgraced, Antony and Cleopatra fled back to Egypt. But there was no escape. Octavian's legions pursued them, closing in on Alexandria. Surrounded and with no hope left, the famous lovers chose to die rather than be paraded through the streets of Rome in chains. Antony, hearing a false rumor that Cleopatra was already dead, fell on his own sword. Cleopatra, after a final defiant meeting with Octavian, arranged to have a poisonous snake, an asp, smuggled to her. According to legend, she held it to her body and met her end with a queen's dignity. With their deaths, the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 300 years was over. Egypt became just another province of Rome, its immense wealth now flowing directly into Octavian's treasury. At just 33 years old, Octavian stood alone. All his rivals were dead. The entire Roman world was his. Octavian returned to Rome the undisputed master of the world, but he was smarter than his great-uncle Caesar. He knew that Romans despised the title of king, so he put on a masterclass in political theater. He went before the Senate and, in a show of incredible humility, announced he was restoring the Republic and handing all his power back to them. Of course, it was a beautifully orchestrated move. The senators, many of whom owed their careers and even their lives to him, begged him to stay. They showered him with honors and titles, and then they gave him a new name, one that placed him above all other mortals, Augustus, the revered one. With that name, the illusion of the Republic was maintained, but the reality was clear. One man now held all the power. The Roman Empire had officially begun. Under Augustus, the endless cycle of civil wars finally stopped. This new era was called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For the next 200 years, the Mediterranean world would see a level of stability and prosperity it had never known. Augustus became a master builder, famously boasting he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Roads connected the vast empire. The legions secured the frontiers, trade boomed, and art and literature flourished. But this peace came at a price. The freedoms of the old republic, the right to vote, the power of the Senate, the political debates, were gone. They had been traded for security and order. Power no longer rested with the people, but with one man, the emperor. Augustus had brilliantly transformed chaos into an empire, but as he built this gleaming new world, a question lingered beneath the surface. Was this golden age of peace built on a solid foundation? Or had he simply created a beautiful mask, hiding the cracks that would one day shatter the greatest empire the world had ever seen? The hum of bustling markets, the joyous laughter of children, the gentle splash of a fountain. A mule cart creaks past, its wheels rattling against ancient cobblestones. Rome wasn't just emperors and epic battles. It was families, merchants, farmers, and slaves. Its roads stretched across continents, its aqueducts carried water for millions, and its arenas thundered with the cheers for gladiators. To truly understand Rome's greatness, we must walk its streets, enter its homes, and listen to the echoes of its people. Imagine waking at dawn in the capital of the world's greatest empire. The narrow streets are already alive with a symphony of noise. Shopkeepers are throwing open their stalls, bakers are pulling fragrant bread from scorching ovens, and merchants are haggling loudly in markets that overflow with goods from across the known world. Gleaming olive oil from Spain, exotic spices from Arabia, and shimmering silks from the Far East. Carts clatter over the stone pavements, their iron wheels echoing between the tall, imposing apartment blocks known as insulae, where most of the city's population lived. These insulae were crowded, noisy, and often dangerous. Fires were a constant threat, and structural collapses were not uncommon. Above, colorful washing lines stretch like spiderwebs between buildings. Below, beggars call out for coins from the passing crowds. The air itself is a thick mixture of baking bread, drifting smoke, and the undeniable scent of humanity. This was the real Rome, the city that lived and breathed every single day. The stark divide between the rich and the poor shaped every aspect of daily life. The wealthy elite resided in elegant homes called a domus, beautiful houses complete with open courtyards, walls adorned with vibrant paintings, intricate mosaics, and tranquil fountains. Their atriums, or main halls, were decorated with statues and special shrines dedicated to the household gods, the lares. Meanwhile, the poor were crowded into cramped insulae, often with an entire family living in a single small room. Cooking fires filled the air with smoke, and fresh water was a precious commodity, usually fetched from a public fountain down in the street. Yet, whether rich or poor, Romans shared common traditions. Meals of bread, cheese, olives, and wine were staples for everyone, and grand public festivals brought the entire city together in celebration, momentarily blurring the lines between classes. At the very heart of Roman life was the family. At its head stood the paterfamilias, the male head of the household, who held complete legal authority over his wife, children, and even his slaves. Deep respect for ancestors was a sacred duty. Portraits of them were kept in prominent places within the home, and their memory was regularly honored. Children were educated by private tutors or attended small local schools. Boys were trained for public life and careers in politics or the military, while girls were prepared for the duties of marriage and managing a household. But don't be mistaken. Within the private sphere, women often wielded quiet but significant power, managing complex households and sometimes even influencing politics from behind the scenes. Beyond the bustling capital, Rome's lifeblood flowed from the vast countryside. The majority of Romans were connected to farming in some way, whether as small landowners, tenants renting plots, or slaves toiling on vast agricultural estates known as latifundia. Fields of wheat, groves of olive trees, and sprawling vineyards filled the landscape. A marvel of engineering, the famous Roman roads carried this agricultural produce to the cities, feeding a population that numbered in the millions. The land sustained Rome, but it also revealed the empire's growing and deep reliance on slave labor. Conquered peoples worked the estates, their immense toil hidden behind the empire's glittering grandeur. Slaves were a ubiquitous presence in Roman society. They cooked the meals, educated the children, built the magnificent monuments, and entertained the roaring crowds in the arena. Some were treated with a degree of kindness, many others endured brutal, unforgiving conditions. Yet Rome was unique in that it allowed paths to freedom. Slaves could be manumitted or set free by their owners. Many of these freedmen rose to remarkable positions of wealth and influence. Some even became full Roman citizens. Still, it's a stark truth that slavery was the very foundation upon which Rome's immense prosperity was built. Rome's genius lay not only in conquest, but in groundbreaking engineering. Incredible aqueducts stretched for miles across the landscape, carrying fresh, clean water into the city. Fountains splashed in public squares, supplying that vital water for the poor. The grand public baths became the vibrant centers of daily social life. They were places not just for washing, but for lively conversation, exercise, and even conducting business deals. To step into a Roman bathhouse was to enter a world of steam, polished marble, and constant chatter, where senators and commoners alike could share the same warm pools. Romans absolutely loved spectacle. Theaters staged popular plays and raucous comedies. Chariot races thundered through the Circus Maximus, where crowds of hundreds of thousands roared for their favorite teams. The Reds, the Whites, the Blues, the Greens. And of course, in the mighty Colosseum, gladiators fought, often to the death, their desperate struggles watched by emperors and slaves alike. For the people of Rome, these games were more than just entertainment. They were a raw display of power, a brutal reminder that the empire could give life or take it away in an instant. Bread and circuses, as the poet Juvenal famously wrote, were what kept the masses satisfied and distracted. Religion permeated every part of Roman life. The gods were everywhere, in small household shrines, in magnificent temples towering above the forum, and in the sacred rituals that marked births, marriages, and harvests. Jupiter, the king of the gods, ruled the skies. Mars, the god of war, guarded the legions. Venus, the goddess of love, blessed relationships. Sacrifices and prayers were performed to maintain the Pax Romana, the peace between Rome and her gods. Yet Rome was also a cosmopolitan city of many faiths, welcoming foreign deities from conquered lands. In time, one of these foreign religions, a small sect called Christianity, would rise from obscurity to transform the empire itself. As dusk begins to fall, torches are lit, casting a flickering glow upon the streets. Families gather for their evening meal, while the local taverns fill with laughter and music. Children play by the light of the moon near the fountains. Soldiers off duty share wine and tell tales of the distant frontiers. In the distance, the Colosseum looms, its iconic arches glowing in the firelight. The city hums with an energy, a ceaseless pulse. It is the very heartbeat of an empire. Rome was never just its emperors and generals. It was the shopkeepers and the slaves, the mothers and the children, the farmers and the soldiers. Its true greatness was not only found in its victorious battles, but in the millions of ordinary lives lived every day beneath its marble arches and terracotta roofs. The sounds of the market begin to fade. In their place, we hear a new sound, the distant rhythmic rumble of marching boots. For a time, Rome seemed eternal. Her aqueducts flowed, her arenas thundered, her markets bustled with life. But beyond her borders, storm clouds were gathering, because peace, as history shows, cannot last forever, and every empire, no matter how great, must eventually face its tests. Thank you so much for joining us on this walk through ancient Rome. The clash of swords echoes in distant lands. The sound of marching legions fades into silence. Sunlight glitters on white marble, the city of Rome gleaming beneath the midday sky. Under emperors like Trajan and Hadrian, Rome reached its zenith. From the windswept moors of Britain to the sun-scorched deserts of Mesopotamia, the empire stretched across the known world. But even as its borders expanded, a crucial question began to form in the minds of its wisest rulers. Could such a vast dominion truly last? Imagine an empire so immense it would take months just to cross it. This was Rome in the 2nd century CE. It was, without a doubt, the greatest empire of its age. At its peak under Emperor Trajan, Rome covered over 5 million square kilometers, ruling a diverse population of more than 60 million people. Think about that for a second. To the north, Roman walls stood firm on the edge of what we now call Scotland, where cold, biting winds whipped across the moors. To the south, Roman legions patrolled the vast deserts of Africa, guarding the frontiers against nomadic tribes. And to the east, Rome's golden eagles, the standards of its legions, reached the historic banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This wasn't just a European power. It was an empire that spanned 3 continents, uniting cultures from the Iberian Peninsula to Syria, from Egypt to Britain, all under one rule. It was a true world power. The man who took Rome to this incredible territorial height was Trajan. Ruling from the year 98 to 117, he is remembered as the empire's greatest conqueror. He was a soldier emperor, most comfortable on the battlefield. His most famous campaigns were in Dacia, which is modern-day Romania. These wars were brutal, but they brought unimaginable wealth back to Rome. The gold from Dacian mines flooded the imperial treasury, funding some of the most spectacular monuments the city had ever seen. One of these, Trajan's Column, still stands in Rome today. If you look closely, you can see its incredible spiral carvings, a stone storyboard depicting his victories in stunning detail. But Trajan didn't stop there. His ambition pushed him eastward into Mesopotamia, bringing Rome to its absolute greatest territorial extent. For a brief moment, the empire's grasp was longer than ever before. However, with this massive expansion came new problems. Holding such distant lands stretched the Roman supply lines dangerously thin. It was a logistical nightmare. Yet despite these strains to his people, Trajan was the ideal emperor, the Optimus Princeps, or the best of emperors. For generations after, this was the highest compliment a new ruler could receive, to be compared favorably to Trajan. When Trajan died, his successor Hadrian took a very different approach. Where Trajan had expanded, Hadrian decided it was time to consolidate and secure. He was a pragmatist. He understood that Rome could not endlessly push its borders outward. Instead, he focused on strengthening what Rome already possessed. Hadrian is most famously remembered as a builder of walls. The most legendary of these, of course, is Hadrian's Wall in Britain. This wasn't just a simple barrier. It was a massive stone frontier, cutting clear across the island, complete with forts, mile castles, and watchtowers. It was a definitive statement, marking the very edge of Roman civilization. Beyond it lay the unconquered tribes of Caledonia, a land Rome never fully managed to tame. Hadrian was also a tireless traveler. He spent more than half of his reign journeying across the empire, inspecting cities, fortresses, and provinces from one end to the other. He wanted to see his empire with his own eyes. Under his rule, Rome solidified its identity not just as a military superpower, but as a sophisticated network of roads, aqueducts, and cities, all bound together by Roman law and a shared culture. He reinforced the idea of a united Roman world. And at the heart of this world was Rome itself, the Golden City. It was a place that dazzled the senses. Magnificent temples with towering columns, Opulent public baths where citizens socialized, and grand forums filled the city with marble grandeur. The roars from amphitheaters like the Colosseum were deafening, as crowds watched gladiators fight for their lives. Inside the Senate House, politicians debated the fate of millions beneath gilded ceilings. The Colosseum, in particular, stood as an undeniable symbol of Roman might and engineering prowess. It was an arena where emperors could showcase their generosity or their cruelty before tens of thousands of cheering citizens. But for all its splendor, the city of Rome also exposed the deep contradictions of the empire. Incredible wealth existed right next to abject poverty. The noble elite in their sprawling villas shared the same crowded streets with the masses of the poor and the enslaved. It was a city of extremes, a microcosm of the empire itself, a place of magnificent achievement but also of stark inequality. However, Rome's true strength wasn't just confined to its capital. It lay in its provinces. Far-flung cities like Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, and Carthage in North Africa were not just provincial backwaters. They were thriving hubs of trade, culture, and learning. In Gaul, which is modern-day France, a sophisticated network of Roman roads stitched the countryside together, facilitating trade and troop movements. From Spain, a steady flow of olive oil, wine, and precious silver made its way across the Mediterranean. And the fertile lands of Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire, produced the grain that fed millions, including the population of Rome itself. Every corner of this vast empire was connected by Rome's incredible infrastructure. A soldier stationed at a remote fort on the German frontier could feel a sense of connection to the heart of the empire. The very coins in his pocket were stamped with the emperor's image, a constant reminder of who was in charge. For many people living under Roman rule, gaining Roman citizenship was the ultimate prize. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a mark of status that conferred legal rights, protections, and a profound sense of belonging to the greatest civilization of its time. But even at this glorious peak, the cracks were beginning to show. The sheer size of the empire was becoming a liability. The vast distances made communication painfully slow. A message from Rome to Britain could take weeks. The army, though powerful, was stretched thin defending thousands of miles of border. And enemies were constantly pressing on those frontiers, from Germanic tribes across the Rhine and Danube to the powerful Parthian Empire in the east. Hadrian, and the emperors who followed him, realized that conquest had its limits. The empire could be maintained, but constant expansion was unsustainable. It came at a tremendous cost: the risk of rebellions in newly conquered territories, overextended supply lines, and armies exhausted by perpetual warfare. Rome's greatness had also become its greatest burden. In the age of Trajan and Hadrian, the Roman Empire must have seemed eternal, invincible. Its disciplined armies marched with unwavering confidence. Its cities glistened with polished marble, and its roads reached out to connect the known world. It was a golden age of peace and prosperity, the Pax Romana. Yet even in the midst of all this glory, the wisest observers whispered words of caution. They understood a fundamental truth: no empire, no matter how powerful or how vast, can escape the relentless passage of time. The triumphant cheers of the crowds and the sharp clash of swords would eventually fade, replaced by the distant rumble of an approaching storm. The empire was glorious, yes, but shadows were already gathering on the horizon. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey back to the height of the Roman Empire. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the incredible stories from our past, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us create more content like this for you. We'll see you in the next one.